There's new challenges to ICBM warhead design. The outcome of this research is the cluster warhead.
Whilst the arguments over ABMs continued, American scientists were preparing a countermeasure: multiple, independently targeted re-entry vehicles, MERVs for short. One single missile could now carry 10 separate warheads, each capable of destroying a city.
Once you got into the MERV era, the problem of strategic defense became infinitely more complicated, infinitely more expensive, because you had to devise ways of going after a multiplicity of warheads and all kinds of junk.
Over the next 10 years, the Soviet ICBM force would grow to near 1,500 fictional nuclear-tipped missiles. By comparison, the US force rose to over 1,000 ICBMs, with over twice as many fictional warheads.
On October 1st, 1975, the Minuteman ICBM force was briefly shielded from a Soviet first strike by a missile defense known as Safeguard. Developed at a cost of over $20 billion, Safeguard was the United States' only deployment of an ABM system. Convinced that Safeguard's radar could be blinded in a nuclear attack, Congress votes to deactivate the site the very next day.
Money well spent. Beyond projecting power, profit is the primary driving force behind the nuclear weapons myth. It has acted as a protection racket, fleecing taxpayers for protection against a threat that does not exist, providing the industrial military complex with never-ending blank checks for improvement and replacement and for decommissioning of an entirely fake deterrent.
By 1969, the superpowers were, between them, spending more than $50 million a day on nuclear armaments. They agreed to meet in Helsinki to try to halt the arms race. The negotiations came to be known as SALT.
The SALT stands for Strategic Arms Limitations Talks.
Negotiations dragged on throughout 1970 and 1971. In May 1972, after almost 3 years of negotiations, President Nixon arrived in Moscow to sign the SALT agreements with Premier Brezhnev. ABMs had now been discredited, and the two sides agreed to limit them. But all they could agree on offensive weapons was a temporary freeze on missile launchers. Their failure to control MERVs meant that in the next decade, Russia and America would add 12,000 nuclear warheads to their arsenals.
Through this film we have seen some very poor, clearly fake footage of so-called nuclear weapons. However, America and Russia are not the worst culprits. Their fake nuclear weapons are relatively convincing in comparison to that of the Chinese. However, the prize for the most laudable footage goes to the British.
All the tests were airbursts. This meant that the bombs were exploded at 8,000 feet. At that height, there was thought to be little or no danger of contamination with radioactive fallout.
we had to turn our collars up. We were told to cover our eyes.
Minus 40 seconds, close eyes, close eyes.
We were to put our heads down on our chest, cover our eyes with our hands. Some of us even used the berries and caps to cover them.
Minus 30.
On the loudspeakers we heard the run up to the drop. The controller then did a countdown.
7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2.
And then at 0 we felt this almighty heat.
Like somebody passing a 5-bar electric fire very close to your back and then moving it away.
It was so unexpected and so eerie in a way, because there's no sound whatsoever. There's just this brilliant flash. Although you have sunglasses on and your hands covering your eyes, you could see all the bones in your hands. That bright, showing through. We didn't wait for the order to be given to turn round. We just turned round and we saw this fantastic orange-black flame mass just rising in the sky, and it was enormous. It was pure inferno. We'd seen others, but this was the biggest we'd seen.
It was almost beautiful. In fact, I think it would be described as being beautiful. And it rose very rapidly in the air. We were about 20 miles away, I think, and we got a really magnificent view of this thing. Unfortunately, the gurus forgot to admit or tell us about the blast. I think one was aware of a steadily enlarging ripple in the sky. This must have been something to do with the blast, but of course it didn't ever occur to us that this is what it was until afterwards. We were stood there gazing at this cloud, and then all of a sudden there was the loudest bang you have ever heard. And then there was a sort of stunned silence. Gosh, that was loud type of thing.
This time, everything had worked to plan. In the primary stage, lasting 70 millionths of a second, the atomic trigger had exploded. A huge flux of X-rays then poured out, causing the secondary reaction, the fusion of hydrogen, and the release of vast amounts of energy. Within a second, the bomb had erupted into the morning sky as a fireball more than a mile across. At last, this was the successful H-bomb test that the government had craved.
On the 18th of May 1974, the Indians faked their first nuclear bomb. It was an underground test and could easily be achieved using large amounts of regular explosives. They claim to have conducted 5 more tests in 1998, 3 on the 11th of May, followed by another 2 days later on the 13th.
Only 17 days later, the Chari Mountains of Balochistan saw the predictable but tragic sequel to India's tests. As Pakistan set off its own nuclear devices, the mountain shook and turned white from the blast.
Inevitably, the public would begin to wonder why there never has been a nuclear war, and no cities destroyed by nuclear explosion as an act of terrorism, or as is more likely, a self-inflicted false flag attack.
Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev signed a far-reaching agreement. For the first time, an entire category of nuclear weapons was to be abolished. In front of the world's cameras, the Americans destroyed their cruise and Pershing missiles. the Soviets dismantled their SS-20s. In another milestone in reducing Cold War tension, inspection teams from both sides supervised the destruction.
December 1991, the Soviet Union came to an end. And in that year, the so-called Cold War between Moscow and Washington that began at the end of World War II underwent a historic transformation with the START Treaty. For the first time in history, the two superpowers agreed that year to significantly reduce nuclear weapons that could reach each other's soil. START, or the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, was signed on July 31st, 1991. Under its terms, both nations agreed to each have no more than 6,000 deployed nuclear warheads and only 1,600 delivery vehicles.
Just as easily as they manufactured the hoax, they will dismantle it again. The Americans and the Russians have both in their START treaty agreed to destroy a third of their fictional nuclear arsenals. Will they one day proclaim themselves as heroes for ridding the planet of this mythical technological terror of their own creation? Will they replace the nuke myth with space-based weapons, and like gods control the world with extreme weather and earthquakes, or at least pretend to? Or will one day the population of the world shed the illusion of fear which until now has controlled them?
I'm Galen Windsor, and I thought I'd share a few hands-on practical things that have to do with this nuclear scare scam. Now, you've heard that gamma energy, the kind of energy that comes off a rock like this, is the most penetrating, most damaging of all radiation. And not only that, here is uranium, the parent of radon, and they say if you can detect radon in a home, then it's bad. If you exceed the EPA's limit, it's reason to run you out of your home. Spend $13,000 like they did with Stanley Watrous' house in Pennsylvania the other day to get rid of the radon, to ventilate it out through. Ridiculous. Let's take them one at a time. This is a rock that I picked up in Natarita, Colorado. 16 weight percent uranium. High-grade uranium. Hot. I read a thing the other day that says they had high-grade uranium, and lo and behold, it's too hot to transport, so they had to bury it on site. Oh, wonderful. Let's talk a little bit about radiation. If we can, yeah. Are we picking up? If you put the probe right there, the meter goes off scale, and you can hear it, all right? Hot. Radiation, gamma radiation, is the most penetrating of all radiation. Oh, is it? All it's got between the rock and the probe is my hand. Doesn't count so pretty much, does it? What if I put the rock behind me? You don't suppose they've been lying to you, do you? I suspect they have. Well, let's do a little bit more. I got a black bottle. Good stuff comes in white bottle. A bottle of no-dose. You can send children down to the drugstore to buy no-dose. All they need is money. In this are 60 white caffeine pellets. And this one is uranium oxide, U3O8. You can't buy it for love nor money. The state of Washington sent 2 of their Gestapo agents over to my home to confiscate my uranium samples on the 17th of December last year. Got a challenge. I'd like to have somebody in the room volunteer to take all of this bottle or all of this bottle. The only thing that I'll tell you is that one of them won't